Podcasters. Podcasting Smarter is the official podcast from Podbean, featuring podcasting interviews, best practices, and helpful tips. We're here to give you the tools, resources, product updates, and news to help you get started podcasting and keep your podcast growing.
Thank you so much for being here with us today. We've got Jace and Alice from Queer as Fact, and it's an incredible podcast. We're going to deep dive into it. And first, I'm going to read our intro, and then we'll jump in and get started. So welcome back, everyone, to Podbean's Storytelling Podcast Week and Podcasting Smarter Live Series. This is our live event for June, Pride Through History, a live conversation with the creators of the Queer as Fact podcast, featuring Alice and Jace of the Queer as Fact podcast. For those of you who may be joining us for the first time, Storytelling Podcast Week has live stream sessions like this one with top podcasters and storytellers from scripted fiction and nonfiction podcasts from across our world and our imaginations. We also have exclusive recorded episodes on the Podcasting Smarter podcast. Storytelling Podcast Week is brought to you by Podbean. We're a podcast hosting and monetizing platform and home to over 640,000 podcasts. To start your podcast, head over to podbean.com today. And now we'll jump in. Hi, guys. How's it going?
Good. Thank you very much for having us. We're very excited to be here.
We're so excited to chat with you. And first off, everybody out there who loves the show, or maybe people who haven't heard of it, tell us a little bit about Queer as Fact and how the idea for the show came about.
I guess I'll handle that one because we brought Jace on board a bit later on.
Yeah.
So Queer as Fact has two components. One is our kind of main podcast, Queer as Fact, which is a queer history podcast. What we say is that we talk about queer history around the world and throughout time. So we cover topics from anywhere and any time. We've talked about the Epic of Gilgamesh, which is one of the oldest stories in the world, thousands of years old. And we've talked about things as recent as stuff that's happened in the 2000s. And then we also have episodes which are part of our Queer as Fiction series, where we talk about queer history and media and how those things kind of come together. So both films or TV shows or books about queer history, and also films or TV shows or books or whatever it may be from key moments in queer history. We started this about 5 years ago, I think, 2017. I guess
that's actually 6 years ago.
We started this 6 years ago, and at the time we started it, there was just really nobody doing queer history podcasting. So now we're very lucky to have quite a few other queer history podcasts looking at queer history from different angles. So you might have heard of Bad Gays, who specifically looks at how we talk about problematic queer figures. There's one from The Vault, I think it's called, which is a trans history podcast. There's quite a few different ones now. But back then, there wasn't anyone doing this. And so there was this real gap we saw in kind of taking queer history and taking some of the more academic research and that kind of stuff and making it really accessible and engaging for the general public so they could realize the breadth of stuff that was out there. So we just kind of began with that idea that we wanted to make queer history more accessible and make it really sort of fun and engaging and something that people could really easily get into. And from there, we created the podcast.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's really a collaborative podcast, right? It's not one person in the mic. There's four of you guys. So tell us a little bit about the team and Jace, how you got involved. And I think everybody out there also wants to know how Queer as Fiction came about as well, because, I think the narrative journey that you take people on, it's so engaging. And I think centering queer history is incredibly important. So tell us a little bit about the team and Queer as Fiction as well.
Yeah, so there's four of us, and we all knew each other well before we started the podcast. I was, in fact, already living with Eli when the podcast started, which is kind of an explanation for how we ended up with Queer as Fiction episodes, which is basically just that Eli and I would be constantly talking about the fact that there was podcast recording equipment in the house, and we had a lot of things that we wanted to talk about. And in particular, because unlike Alice, Irene, and Eli, who all have kind of a history and classics background, my background is in media and politics. And so I'm much more interested in kind of media analysis and communications and that side of things. So, yeah, we kind of thought, well, why not add a little bit more content, bring a fourth person on board so that, we can kind of spread the workload out a bit more. And then, so it was, I think, about 9 or 10 months after the start of the podcast when I joined in to, I think, edit a couple of episodes, and I maybe sat in on as an audience member on one.
Yeah, probably as a way of kind of easing you into what we did. Yeah.
Yeah. And then, started doing the queerest fiction episodes. But yeah, so I think there was a lot of just sort of being for queer people who, hung out together a lot and would have a lot of conversations and would read interesting Wikipedia articles or read, read little tidbits or posts on Tumblr that would sort of mention something. And it's like, is that true? Like, what is going on there? And then sort of going and deep diving into that and, trying to bring across something with a bit more thorough, rigorous, well-researched basis to it.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's something where, a lot of the time queer history is a footnote, right? And so taking that footnote and, filling that out, fleshing out the reality of the history is such an important aspect. And I think on the queer as fiction side, it's really one of those life imitates art, imitates life kind of situations as well. So yeah, it's just a fantastic show. And can you both share some insights? I think, Jace, you kind of touched on this of, you guys all being friends and finding things that were of interest. But can you guys talk about the process of researching the topics and episodes for the show? Because, there's so much research that goes into it.
Yeah, I think it really varies episode to episode because depending on what kind of queer history you're doing, you could be looking at books or we could be looking at, going on YouTube and looking for interviews, looking at newspaper articles. It could be anything. If people want a really, thorough step-by-step process, I'll be honest, I start at Wikipedia. No, before that, we have a list of suggestions that our listeners have been sending in for years and years, and there's hundreds of suggestions on that list. So I'll generally go to that list and think, what do I want to talk about? Maybe I want to focus on a particular country or a particular theme like lesbian history or trans history, two-spirit history, whatever it might be. And I'll kind of go through that list and find someone who fits into that category. And then I'll go to Wikipedia and find out, what are the main books on that topic? What are the main biographies or whatever it may be that are referenced on that? And then it's just a lot of reading and note-taking, thousands and thousands of words of note-taking and hours of reading books. And then I think that part is time-consuming, but, just reading stuff and writing it down. And then the really challenging part of not so much the research, but once we get into creating a podcast episode is taking what is often a huge amount of content, which is probably surprising given how much queer history has been erased, but taking a huge amount of content and information and thinking like, what parts of this are really important for our audience? What parts are going to be engaging and keep people interested? And how are we going to actually pull that all together into an hour of content, which sounds like a long time, but is a really short time when you want to cover someone's whole life or a whole kind of period and moment in history and queer experience in that moment. So a decent amount of my time researching is definitely, well, not researching, but creating an episode is definitely spent just cutting down and really trying to figure out what are the key moments that will draw people in and will tell people something really interesting about queer history.
Yeah, absolutely. Oh, Jace?
I was just going to say, I think it's interesting to compare that to sort of the process I have for a lot of the queerest fiction episodes because obviously, I don't have to do as much archival research and, reading extensive biographies of people. It's not to say I don't have to do that at all. I've definitely done it a couple of times. But, particularly if we're talking about, something from the 50s or 60s, often, we have sort of interviews with the director or writer of the movie. And so it's reasonably simple to sort of get, sort of authorial intent, which is often a real difficult thing when it comes to someone's actual life, especially if it was hundreds of years ago, sort of trying to figure out what they intended when they said certain things. But then, what I find is often trying to balance sort of presenting a piece of media and sort of talking about that piece of media, but trying to situate that within a sort of historical context and trying to situate that within a media context. And so trying to find, that's kind of where a lot of my historical research goes. It goes a lot broader of like, okay, what did the movie landscape look like at this time? Or what did the theatre landscape look like at this time? And what were contemporary pieces of media that were happening? How were people reacting to them? That kind of thing. So yeah, I think it's a kind of, I don't have to go as deep into individual people's lives often, but I do have to kind of look at what was the rest of society doing so that I can contextualize how they might have reacted to this piece of media.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you both said so much, so I think Jace will start there. I mean, like, what was the cultural zeitgeist, right? Because when you're looking at the queer experience through the history of media, right? I think one of your latest episodes is on like British film noir in the 60s, right? It's something where, okay, how was the media portraying the queer experience in the 60s, right? What was being said, what was being shown, what wasn't. I think that's also a really important aspect. It's not just a piece of work, but it's about the society and the culture that was surrounding it at that time. And Alice, you said so much in terms of what goes into making an episode. So for everybody out there who listens to the podcast, loves podcasts, or who has a podcast, I think it's really important to understand Wikipedia, right? It isn't verified, but it can be your friend. There's resources there. And I think, we're all guilty of that. It's definitely something where, if you Google something or you think, oh, I wonder about that historical figure. I wonder about Isadora Duncan. I wonder about the history of, queer piracy, whatever it is. It's something where, you start on Wikipedia, but they'll have references listed, and then that'll take you down a rabbit hole of verified information and things that have gone to publication. And so, there's definitely ways to go about it in a legitimate way through Wikipedia. So I think that's really interesting. And just the way you mentioned also pulling things out, right? An hour isn't that long, especially when you're discussing things and you're excited and you want to create that narrative thread. I think it's something that it's important to understand. And we talk about this all the time at Podbean, just being focused on the listener experience, right? And making sure that it's listener forward. Hey, maybe this happened. This was part of the narrative, but is it pivotal? Will it fit into the episode? Does it fit into the arc of the narrative that we're telling about this person or the subject? So I think that's a really important aspect as well, because I think maybe everybody these days is kind of guilty of going down a rabbit hole, right? A historical rabbit hole or a Wikipedia rabbit hole or a media rabbit hole. I think, whether it's via TikTok or social media or Wikipedia, and finding, one thing leads to another and kind of just going down following that path. And, on the internet, a lot of things aren't verified, but just, seeing where it leads you. I think there is so much extraneous information. It's really easy to get sidetracked. And so I think in terms of creating the episode, it must be sometimes a little bit of a challenge to kind of think, okay, what am I leaving on the cutting room floor? So
yeah. I was just going to say, in terms of the audience experience stuff, I mean, that's one of the things with the structure of how our podcast works is, we will have one person who's gone away and done the research, and then we'll have, 1 to 2 other people sitting there who haven't done the research and maybe heard of this person, or, if it's a movie, obviously I get them to watch the movie because it'd be weird if they hadn't. But what we're trying to do with that is reflect the way that a listener will hear something and maybe be like, oh, hang on, stop, expand on that more. And, that's kind of our role when we're not hosting episodes directly, when we haven't done the research ourselves, is to sort of be that audience surrogate and to try and, represent the audience's curiosity for little tidbits that will come up in the episode that the researcher might be like, oh, okay, I've just, I've got so much information in front of me that it's hard for me to see what is interesting, because it's hard to see, like you're missing the forest for the trees kind of thing.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's what's so great about the group of you guys, and that the listener can, go along on the journey with whoever is also recording but hasn't been the main researcher of the episode, right? It's definitely something where you're along for the ride. And I want to ask you both, what have some of your favorite episodes been of the show to record, and why?
It's interesting that you said favorite to record, because I feel like favorites to like research and favorite overall is
let's
different.
do both.
Well, the one that came to mind was one that I thought that was a favorite to research, but maybe not favorite to record. Not that it was bad. I recently did one on women's sexuality in ancient Rome, and I really enjoyed doing that because I studied classics at uni. I learned Latin and I learned all about ancient Rome and everything, and it was through not even that much fault of my teachers, just through the fault of the field over years and years and years. It was very male focused. And we'd done several episodes looking at men's sexuality in Rome. And every time I pick up a book about men's sexuality in Rome, there's like a little chapter or a little note even that kind of says, oh, and we acknowledge that there are women too. We're not going to talk about them here, but women do exist.
Right.
And in my episode I'd originally done years ago on men in Rome, I'd done the same thing. I'd said like, look, I'm not going to talk about women today, but one day I will. And so finally, a couple of years ago, someone actually published a book about women's sexuality in ancient Rome. It only took 2,000 years, but they got there. And so I was just really excited to finally be able to come to that topic and give it the time it deserved and not make women's history just be a little footnote to men's history that never got properly explored. So that was a favorite of mine in terms of research. I think there are some that are also just very fun to record. Like some people's stories, either that is kind of, absurd or joyful or really uplifting. I think one episode that a lot of our listeners really connected with and tell us they go back to and listen and that we also enjoyed recording was the life of, trying to think how to pronounce her name before I say this. It's a long time ago. Tove Jansson, I think is how you say it. The woman who invented Moomins, which are like little cartoon characters. I don't know if you'd be familiar with them or not. And like she just invented these really cute little characters. She used them to write children's books. She used them to draw. She was alive during World War II. She used them to draw anti-fascist cartoons. She lived on this little island with her girlfriend. They had a little cabin on this island together. And like something like that, where it's just such a wholesome, positive, uplifting story. Those ones are really, really a joy to record.
Yeah, absolutely. And I can, you can definitely tell why people go back and listen to them to that, to hear that heartwarming and wholesome side of things where there is a happily ever after and, you're on an island drawing cartoons.
Yeah, I think especially because people so often, especially if people are just coming out, they assume and hearing what's in the news and everything about like trans rights and that kind of thing, they just assume that queer experience has been so negative and will inevitably to some degree be negative. And it's really good to be able to counter that and show examples where queer people have just had good lives.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Jace, do you have any favorite episodes?
I think for me, there's a pretty clear favorite, which was the Wonder Woman episode, which was kind of the first episode I did that required a bit more kind of historical research. And I kind of, stretched to the limit of my historical abilities, which I've kind of since gone on and done the Gawain and the Green Knight episode, which was, hundreds of years ago. And so it required me to look at Middle Ages historical texts and that kind of thing. But the Wonder Woman episode where we looked at both the lives of the creators of Wonder Woman and also the sort of original run of Wonder Woman comics from the early 1940s was super fun for me because it was something where I watched a YouTube video which mentioned this when the first Gal Gadot Wonder Woman movie came out in 2014 or whatever.
Yeah, a while ago.
That was just casually as an aside mentioned, so the creator of these comics was a polyamorous, bisexual, kinky person who and I was like, what?
Yeah.
Excuse me?
Right.
And then you see, it's the same, you see those out of context comic panels in Tumblr posts and stuff where it's oh, that's a little weird. And, sometimes it's just, old Batman comics where he's I need Dick, and it's because Dick Grayson is the name of Robin. And that's just obviously completely out of context. But with the Wonder Woman ones, it was this does look quite gay. There seems to be something going on here. What is happening? And then, you go back into the lives of these creators and you can really sort of identify that. And then the other fun thing about that episode was then in the recording of the episode, this was something I kind of had to sort of figure out how to present this to an audience, was, showing Alice and Eli the panels from the comics where I'm like, so here's an example of what they were doing in these comics. And a lot of it's based on the sort of real world experiences of these people, and their real world kind of, almost like political and sexual ideology, which was just super interesting to hear about in terms of a 1940s comic, and also obviously something that's so well known today and sort of a very normal part of culture, to have such a weird origin.
Yeah, absolutely. And something where, at the time, the queer experience of the creator was so visible, right?
Mhm.
And it's something where, as time went on, as history went on, it became diluted, but to go back to those origins and to highlight that person's life and how there are similarities today between how a lot of people can openly live is important, right? And showcases like the lived experience, I think, which is really cool.
Yeah. I mean, a lot of the like very modern Wonder Woman comics have kind of gone back and dug into that origin to then create new stories. And it's like, okay, you're doing this in a much more sort of reasonable way where you're not trying to like get around the censorship to promote a weird message that doesn't really make a lot of sense, because the people who are doing it, whilst it's very cool, there was also a lot of nonsense. So it's really interesting to see after decades of this character kind of being her queerness being sort of shoved away
Or minimized,
to have that thing come back and have it feel really organic and really earned, because of the history of that character, is super cool.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And I want to kind of ask you both next, because there is this, it's such a fun show, right? You've done all this research, you're diving deep, first Wikipedia, but then, the real research and reading all the books. But there is also like a really fun entertainment component of the show. So, in terms of making sure that you have that balance, how do you approach the storytelling in the podcast?
Good question, because, I think firstly, because we're all good friends outside of the podcast and have been friends for a decade now, it comes very naturally to us to just, talk very like casually, like we're talking to each other the way we talk to each other outside of the podcast. So it's very easy for us to create that kind of relaxed, engaging atmosphere for our listeners. I don't think we've actively thought about how to make that engaging, except for the fact that we've thought about knowing that we want that conversational format will make that engaging for our listeners. I think you look like you want to say something, Jace.
I was just going to say, I mean, I feel like I have, on occasion, only very rarely, actually scripted in some jokes.
The truth comes out. Did you just think of them in advance and then?
Yeah. Well, I'm writing the script, and because I write scripts in my voice, like I know that I'm writing this in a way that I'm going to say it. Yeah. And so I'll sort of be like, oh, I know Alice and Eli and Irene so well that I can sort of be like, I know how they're going to kind of react to this, so I can kind of put in a little tidbit there. But I do think overall it's funny because we get feedback from people who are like, oh my God, you guys are so funny, or you're so engaging. Yeah. And, we've always found it a little bizarre, to be honest, because, what we're primarily aiming to do is be informative. The fact that the podcast is then entertaining is a massive plus, and obviously, means that people come back and keep listening. But I don't think there's been a lot of, I don't think we've really made any concessions to format aside from maybe the length of the episodes.
Yeah.
That have been concessions to entertainment as opposed to being informative. That's always the primary goal.
I think there are topics that I haven't touched because I know they would be very... Obviously, we do deal with some quite dark and difficult material, but there are definitely people I've looked up or topics I've looked up where I've just gone, this will just be miserable from start to finish. This won't be an enjoyable story. And, there is some importance in telling hard queer stories, but there are also stories that I do look at. And, it's people's lives which have been, where there's no light, where they've, like, people who have been continually discriminated against and there's nothing positive for us to pull out of it. I generally don't tell those stories, but that's as much for my own sake as for the audience's sake. I would look at those stories and go, I don't want to research that. I don't want to immerse myself in that for the months it's going to take me to put this together. So it's both about making it positive and engaging and enjoyable for us as it is for the audience.
Yeah, I think that's also a really important aspect. And the fact that you guys are all friends, you almost feel like when you're listening, you kind of get to be part of the friend group. It's like,
That's what we hope for.
I think it is.
I think that's definitely kind of feedback that we've gotten, and I don't know. I don't know if you guys intended that from the start.
I don't think we would have put it in so many words, but I think we were going for that kind of friendly atmosphere.
Yeah, familial. Because you kind of almost feel like, because it's so conversational, it's almost like you're part of the conversation of hearing the story and chiming in and learning all the nuance of whatever the specific topic of the episode is. So I think that's a really fun aspect as well. And I also just want to know, I'm wondering, Alice, if you can break down kind of the production side of what an average episode, not that you guys have an average episode, but kind of break down, like, okay, you've done the research. Let's say it's your episode, you're the lead, you've done the research, you guys record, and then after that, is it the person that does the research that's going to edit?
It really depends. Honestly, mostly it depends on who has the free time, who's going to edit. So we do definitely, try to do a schedule. And for example, we said Jace will generally edit our media episodes, but it's pretty ad hoc. I do sometimes personally step in and go, no, I want to edit the episode that I presented. And it's usually when I want to fact check myself. If I've said something off the top of my head where I go, I think I read this in a book. Yeah, this happened. And I think I'll say it with confidence in the moment and I'll just delete it afterwards if it's not true. But yeah, the editing is definitely quite a process, more of a process than we thought it would be when we started. It's quite time consuming, but we do generally, so our episodes are, say, about an hour long, and we would generally record for 2 hours. So we're cutting a lot of content. We're really tightening it up to make it really engaging and interesting for the audience. Also, to make sure all the information is correct, to make sure it all stays on topic and it flows well. So yeah, it is quite a tightly edited podcast, and there's quite a lot of work involved in that side of it, as well as the research and the presentation side of it.
Yeah, absolutely. And you guys have a pretty dedicated audience. And like you said, the podcast has been going since 2017. So it's been around for a few years. How did you guys initially build your audience? Because it's something where, like you were saying, even just episode topics, you guys have a list of hundreds of topics that the audiences and listeners have sent in. So have you guys employed any strategy in terms of building your audience?
I think we fluctuate between just doing whatever and hoping it sticks and employing strategies. And a lot of that depends on the amount of time we have at our disposal, because we're all working and studying, doing various things as well. So when we have more free time, we will kind of strategize, and that often is strategizing around either our social media. So in terms of things like Pride, making sure we haven't done it this June because we're busy, but previous Junes, having daily posts that are really hyping up our episode topics and tying it into Pride, and also trying to tie episodes into things that may be happening at the time, whether that's a film that's coming out or an anniversary, if it's 200 years since somebody was born, or was trying to do the maths frantically in my head. It was an anniversary of Stonewall a few years ago.
Yeah.
Can't think of anniversary. So yeah, tying in with things like that, that's definitely a way in which we try to kind of reach an audience that doesn't already know about us, but may be interested in something that's happening at the time in the kind of queer zeitgeist.
Yeah, absolutely. And in terms of, because the podcast has been around for quite a few years, and podcasting, when you get to that point where you've produced the show and you've, been recording episodes for years upon years, sometimes things pop up where you're like, oh, I didn't know that would be part of my podcasting journey. So have you guys encountered any challenges in terms of creating the podcast, maybe pod fade or burnout, or it doesn't sound like there's a shortage of topics ever, but do you ever feel like, in terms of maybe wanting to incorporate different themes, I'm just wondering if there's been any challenges or even just surprises in terms of the journey of making the show.
I think to talk about challenges and yeah, as you say, we've got hundreds of suggestions, but an issue I often find is, particularly with the media episodes, is, and this is also true of the history suggestions as well, is that the vast majority of them are, white, a lot of men from Europe or North America. And so, it's trying to be a bit more diverse in the kind of stories that we look at. But then often, especially if life gets really busy or if there's, say, a global pandemic and we're exhausted, you fall back on what is easy in terms of, oh, cool, I've already got the streaming platform that hosts this movie, or like, oh, cool, all the biographies for this person are easily available in English. And so it's very easy for us to pull together an episode in, a month as opposed to an episode on a more obscure figure from a culture that hasn't been as well served by academia. And then it's suddenly that's a 3 or 4 month process where we might have to wait for books to arrive and we might have to, search them out and things like that. Alice, you've gotten help from listeners with translations.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think that's something where there's a tension between sort of what we would want to do ideally, which I'd love to have covered a movie from long term, every country, that kind of thing, where it's I would love to do stuff like that, but it's just so much more work. That's where it can be a bit challenging.
Yeah, I think that is our big challenge, is not just balancing what we wish we could do and what we can do, but also just coming to terms with that fact. We so often have conversations with friends who are very well-intentioned who say, oh, I've got this great idea. Why don't you do this? Why don't you reach out to these people? Why don't you do this? It'll make you reach a bigger audience. And we're sitting going, we know we could do all these things, but we just don't have the time.
Yeah.
Physically we can't. And it's very hard. It's very hard to come to terms with that fact.
That is particularly true for, reaching out to other creators or, collaborating with different people. The amount of work it takes, as you, I'm sure, are very well aware, the amount it takes to do a collaboration with another creator is just so infinitely more than the amount of work it takes to collaborate with Alice, who I live in the same house with. Yeah,
absolutely. And I think, when people are listening to a podcast, it's such an enjoyable experience. You don't always know how much work goes into it, right? It's something where you don't, and a lot of podcasts that even are history-based, when you're talking about the amount of research that you guys are putting in terms of reading books that, may not be digitally available or within, a mainstream narrative, it's something that takes more time. It takes more energy to create content around that, right? And I think that kind of also speaks to the main topic as a queer history podcast, right? About how queer history was marginalized and how, having diverse perspectives can be challenging because diverse perspectives, even within the queer community, especially within the queer community, have also been marginalized. Alice, even earlier, specifically when you were talking about the history of women's sexuality in Rome, I think, it's that was a footnote and it took 2,000 years to write that book kind of thing. So I think it is something where it's kind of part of the history within queer history is the marginalization of women and people of color. So it's definitely, and the BIPOC community. So it's definitely something where that aspect must be, kind of a built-in, I don't want to say challenge, but kind of built into the genre in a way as well. Yeah. Absolutely. Yeah. And the fact that you as a team acknowledge it and just, I think, do what you can is important as well. So I think that that's a really important aspect. And I want to ask next, in terms of the episodes that you guys have put months into creating, because it really is a labor of love. It's not a podcast where you guys are doing this as your day job. You have day jobs, you're full-time students, and it's a whole team, right? What have been the episodes that have been the most rewarding, right? Where you felt like, and I think Alice, you kind of spoke to this briefly about the episode about women in Rome. But have there been any where you're like, I'm so glad I told this story?
I'll think of specific examples I talk, but I think the ones that are the most rewarding in that way, I would say, are the ones where the stories genuinely aren't out there except that we've told them. Like, we've done episodes on people who are, maybe their queerness isn't highly publicized, but who are very famous. Like, if we did an episode on Freddie Mercury, for example, the world doesn't need us to tell them about Freddie Mercury. Everyone knows about Freddie Mercury already. It's just, it's nice to have an episode on Freddie Mercury. But I did an episode last year, I think, for example, on an American trans woman named Lucy Hicks Anderson. And I got in touch with people in a local archive in America, and I was using their newspaper scans to put together that episode. And so for something like that, it's really rewarding to be able to take something that's just, on a piece of paper in a small town in America and bring that to an audience who would never have had access to that. They would never have been able to do that research or go to that archive or hear that story. And we've been able to let more of the world know about that person.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that that's such a beautiful example. And, I think probably kind of one of the reasons why the podcast is so special is because, it's opinion and it's fun, but there's also this greater purpose of centering stories that haven't had the opportunity to be told or even recorded down before, right? Even written down or shared on the internet or anything like that. So there is kind of almost an honoring of queer history and bringing it into the forefront that is kind of a mission of the podcast that always feels really special. Yeah.
Yeah. I think for me, you actually made reference to it earlier, but the episode we did recently on Victim, which was a 1960s British film, really resonated with me because it's something that's really interesting to think about in terms of, because our sort of cultural and historical focus, and when I say our, I don't mean our podcasts, although we do fall into that sometimes, but just kind of general popular culture's perspective is so American-centric. We usually think about the 1960s as being a very, a time where queerness was not talked about in media at all. And that's largely because of things like the Hays Code and, very American-centric laws and restrictions on media. But, like in the UK, they were just releasing this movie where there's just like blatantly gay men all over the movie. And, there's no subtext to it. It's not like having to look through and be like, oh, so this actor was gay and that's why, they have this weird little interaction and that's kind of interesting. And maybe that means those two actors were sleeping together or something like that, but like, no, it's just gay guys in the movie. That's the plot of the movie. That's what's going on. And I think that's really important to think about. And it's something we've talked about, like whenever we kind of cover a different country's cinema or like popular culture or anything like that, where it's like, oh, okay, this is what was actually happening at this time. This actually looks quite different to what you would necessarily sort of stereotypically think about that decade or that era.
Yeah, absolutely.
I think there is a tendency, just coming off what you just said, Jace, there is a tendency for us, for people in general, to assume that there's been this really linear progression in queer history from, we were all very oppressed and it was horrible and nobody was allowed to talk about being gay, to this better time we're in now where things are good. And it's, kind of good, not that good. But, it's really interesting to get into those stories like Victim in the 60s, for example, where we can see that there was a chance to talk about queerness, or there were other examples of cultures and societies throughout history that were being more open and more accepting and had different attitudes, and see that there's that real complexity and nuance around the world of the way that queerness has been experienced.
Yeah, absolutely. And you guys are based in Australia. So for everybody out there, I don't know if we mentioned that yet.
We
You
are,
guys
yes.
you're in Melbourne, Australia. And for everyone in America, that's Melbourne, Australia. Yeah. But you really do have a global audience. So it's a show where, and a lot of the stories are from the US, but a lot aren't, right? And I think it's interesting that you guys bring that global perspective, even though you're still in a Western country, you're able to kind of pull examples from different countries and even in the same time period, like you're saying, with the Hays Code and everything in the US in the 60s, how, everything was so secretive, but that wasn't the global experience. And I think that that's a really important aspect, especially, in terms of representation. I think that that's huge, right? Because it's something where it's not something where there was no representation up until a certain point. It's very nuanced and it's subjective, right? To the country and the culture and the decade and, a lot of other factors, right? Like gender or race that can also, affect how safe people were to express themselves and their authentic selves at the time. But I want to kind of center also on the fact that you guys are in Australia and, the show's pretty global. You have a lot of listeners. So I want to talk a little bit about your listener base because it seems like it's a real community that you guys have built in terms of the show. So Irene, can you share a little bit about kind of the feedback you guys have gotten from the community and how you guys engage with your listenership?
I think engaging with our listenership is definitely one of those things that we would love to do more of if we had more time, because the feedback that we do get is so lovely and so positive. Especially, I think my favorite kind of feedback is we get emails from people that say, I've been listening to your podcast for 5 years. I've been listening from the start. And we sort of step back and go, that's so long ago. That's such a journey we've been on. And it's crazy to think that somebody, somewhere on the other side of the world has actually been on that journey with us the whole time. And they'll often tell us, about how listening to our podcast has been alongside them through coming out or through different relationships or different, jobs or experiences they've had, how it's kind of been a constant and a comfort for them through all different things in their life. And that's just such an amazing thing to hear.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Chase?
I think, like also, things like we have a PO box and people send us physical letters and, we've sent back letters to people.
We have one listener in Canada that we just exchange recipes with. They send us Canadian recipes. We send them Australian recipes. It's got nothing to do with queer history.
What are the recipes? Any highlights?
I always struggle to think of Australian recipes, so I don't feel like we have that many.
Banoffee pie, is it Australian?
We definitely have banoffee here. I didn't know it was Australian.
Americans, I don't think have it. I'm not sure about Canadians. So if you're watching live, let us know. Lamingtons, the cake.
Lamingtons, we've done Lamingtons.
Anzac biscuits, also very good.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
But so like we've got a Patreon and we, engage with people through there. And then we've got like things like just our Tumblr and Twitter messages, and people will message us through those. And, it's really interesting to see the kind of array of messages that we get because, some of them will be, people who are very kind of online like us. And so, it's a message from someone who's very similar to us and we're like, oh, cool, we can have a little conversation. And other times it's, someone who's really gone to an effort to find a way to reach out to us. And, those are often the sweetest messages because it's like, oh, you really aren't very online, but you've gone to the effort to find a way to reach out to us, and you've come in and said, I find this podcast really important to me, and it's really important to my coming out journey or whatever it is, and that can be very sweet. I just think also the thing Al said about not only people who've been listening to us for a long time, but oh my god, the people who are like, so I've listened to all your episodes like 3 times.
You guys have quite a lot of episodes.
And we've just hit 150 episodes.
Yeah.
That's a lot of content. And I'm just always like, are you okay? And then I'm like, I will constantly rewatch my favorite content.
Yeah, I think we all have those. We all have those shows and podcasts that we re-listen to for sure.
Yeah, so it's funny to think of being, someone's comfort show.
Absolutely. And I think it's something where, as listeners and creators, it's something where, when you're listening to a podcast, if it's someone you don't know, you kind of don't necessarily think of the entirety of their lives, right?
Mm-hmm.
But then when you're creating the podcast, you're just like you doing your thing, right? You've got like the Fab Four kind of going on. And then it's like, I think when people find the show, there's an aspect of, and this applies to really any podcast that as a listener, we find and we like, there's so much about that person, or you feel, there's a perceived emotional connection with what they've created. And it can be really nice to hear that feedback, to know that you're on the right track or that your work is appreciated. And it means something to people. I think that's really important, especially for Queer as Fact. Yeah.
Mm.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah. I mean, I think you both mentioned, in terms of feedback, people saying this was part of their coming out journey, and the podcast really almost served as like a friend, it seems.
Yeah, absolutely. We do hear that from people. We also hear some feedback we've had quite a few times in, slightly different iterations is from parents who have had their kids come out and either shared the podcast with their kids as a way of like supporting their kids or listen to it themselves as a way of kind of understanding the community that child is becoming a part of. And that's also, it's just like we don't know these people, but we're almost kind of a part of that family's journey and their queer journey. And that's very nice too.
Yeah. No, it definitely, I think you can tell from listening, it feels like a community. It's a really fun show. And that could just be the dynamic of your friend group that just feels so accessible. But I think, people really do feel like they're, a fly on the wall and a part of the show. And Jace, like you mentioned, you guys just hit 150 episodes. You're in season 5 of the show.
I think it's like season,
is it
technically
not 5?
I think it's like season 10.
Oh,
or something
gosh.
like that.
We only started counting seasons like halfway through.
Yeah,
I thought it was season 5. Am I? Oh my gosh. It's not.
Technically, what it is it's 150 episodes. The first, I think, around 50 episodes were not seasoned because it was literally just
got it. All right.
Putting out an episode every 2 weeks. And this is something, in terms of advice for other podcasters.
Consistency.
Not schedule in breaks.
Consistency, but give yourself a break. We didn't give ourselves a break for over a year, and that was madness.
Yeah, it was just
that
every
is madness. Yeah,
in perpetuity. And so that's where we started to have seasons when we started to be like, okay, we're going to do an episode every 2 weeks for 5 months, and then take a month off.
Yeah.
And we've just recently changed our schedule again, and so the seasons kind of like get a bit more.
Okay, thank you, because I didn't get that wrong. Thank you very much. But it's definitely something where I think, and we talk about this just briefly. I'll touch on this. With all the podcasters at Podbean, it seems to be a real juxtaposition of both, right? You want your audience to know when your show's coming out, what day of the week, what time, and to have that consistency. And as a podcaster, you are a human being. So, you need to take breaks, and whatever works for you is also going to be part of the formula that works for your show that your audience resonates with. So it's important to give yourself that grace as well.
I think we often find at this point really that like often we put out new episodes and obviously they, do better than, the older episodes because they're new and now like we've got a core listener base that will listen to every new episode that gets put out. But also what we often find is anytime we get new listeners, we're so grateful. We can literally notice when like a tweet gets like retweeted and 10 people like it. Because even if like 5 of those people will go and listen to every episode in our archive, there's like 750 downloads, right? Like it's like a noticeable bump because of like 5 people from someone's friends list finding the podcast. And that's just so wild to think about now. I think that's, kind of the advantage of having been doing this for so long. And also just, because our episodes are on historical figures or on films and TV shows and books or whatever, where people might organically find them. And, they might be researching this person. So, there's a podcast episode on that. And that's a really really rewarding to see. It's like, oh, okay, people are still seeking information out of this person, still finding our content, and constantly being like, oh, I just found you through this episode. That's a really common thing we see with our reviews and feedback, is I found you through your episode on X.
Freddie Mercury led the way, right? I think that's so important, right? Your content's evergreen. So if there's an episode that somebody finds years from now, right, they'll be able to find the whole catalog, and those episodes are all still relevant. They're from history. You guys have done the research, and I think we've all found podcasts that way, right? A random episode will just guide you into like a cache, right? like a pirate, treasure cache of just, I found this podcast. It's like, when you discover a series and it's like bingeable, it's so exciting, because not only are you enjoying the moment, but you're enjoying the future moments at the same time.
It's funny because there's also a bit of a flip side to that. If somebody, sends us a review or a message or whatever and says, oh, I found your podcast through such and such an episode, and that episode is from 2017, part of me is like, oh no, don't listen to that. That was so long ago. We didn't know how to do anything. It'll sound bad. The research will be worse. Will be more awkward, on it.
If you ask, and we talk about this all the time at Podbean, if you ask any podcaster to go back and listen to their first episode, they will be like, you cannot pay me enough money. You can't.
Absolutely not.
It's definitely, it's a common thing. Yeah.
Yeah. Some of the very few negative comments that we've gotten, it'll be like, oh, the audio is just awful. And we're like, we don't disagree.
Right. The audio was bad.
But
listen to our latest episode. How do you like us now? Right. Yeah.
Yeah. We didn't have a mic each, it was one mic that we were sharing, and also we were recording under a kitchen table with a blanket down the sides,
Yeah, but I think also what's great, being so far into the show, is that your audience has grown with the show, like you mentioned. So it's something where, and a lot of podcasts have expressed this, that the listener is along for the ride, right? They're kind of there with you under the kitchen table at the very beginning. And they're still with you now. And I think for everybody out there who finds the earlier episodes, that content really stands for itself. So even though it's not something that you as creators want to listen to, it definitely still has a lot of value.
That's good.
Yeah. Well, it's been such a pleasure, hearing about the show and what goes into it and the community that you guys have built. Looking ahead, is there anything that listeners and the audience here can look forward to in terms of what's coming up for Queer as Fact and Queer as Fiction?
Well, I guess our next two episodes, yours, you were involved in an episode that's coming out next, and then it'll be my episode after that. So do you want to talk about yours first?
Yeah, so our next episode, I'd just forgotten about it because we recorded it. It's done in my mind, but it's not out yet. We've just done an interview with Danielle Scrimshaw, who is an Australian queer historian, and she's just written a book on the history of queer women in Australia. And similarly to the history of queer women in ancient Rome, it's never been done. There's never been a book about queer women's history in Australia until this year. So that was really exciting to get to talk to her and look at this topic that's been really neglected. And her book's split up chapter by chapter, going through and telling the story of different queer women throughout Australian history. So that's our episode that's coming out in a couple of days, is an interview with her looking at that. So actually, by the time, what day is it today? It'll be out, I think, by the time
it's out. It's out. Yeah, you can listen now. Yeah,
right now. It's already up.
And then July 1st, we'll have out my episode, which is going to be on A League of Their Own, the queer baseball show.
Yeah.
But also looking at the historical context of women's baseball in the US and sort of the queer story, the real life queer stories that the show was then based upon.
Yeah. Is it on the new Amazon series?
Yeah. Okay. So new Amazon series. We are gonna briefly talk about the movie, although the movie's not very queer, so there's not going to be as much to talk about there. I've definitely looking as a preview, been looking a lot into the history, and being like, oh, okay, this is a lot more both easily accessible. I think partly because a lot of people did the research for articles when the show came out.
Yeah.
But also because, this isn't super old history, you know, like especially because when you're talking about sports people in the 50s, in the like 40s and 50s,
Yeah.
it's they were probably 20 to 30 for the most part, and it's like, well, so a lot of them were alive well into the 2000s.
Yeah.
And so, we often have things like obituaries and, things like that will talk about their lives and talk about their partners and their relationships, and interviews that have been done, because, they kind of survived long enough for queer rights activists and historians and journalists to sort of go digging and find information about these people. So that's been really, really fun, and I'm really looking forward to that episode.
Yeah, absolutely. And for their stories to be told, they lived through the change in our culture. So
yeah. Unfortunately, it's another American episode, but I loved the show so much. We have a friend of ours, Gab, who is a queer woman who plays sport. And so she was immediately obsessed with the show. And we were like, well, we have to watch it then. And we all really, really enjoyed it. So, I'm looking forward to getting a season 2, even if it's going to be shorter than what we were hoping. But yeah, hopefully for anyone who hasn't given it a look yet, hopefully our episode will give a few people a nudge to go and check it out.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, that'll be out, you said July 1st. So just coming right up. And so much to look forward to. I think, it's just such a great show, and we're really excited to chat with you guys today. So thank you so much for joining us. I'm going to read our brief outro. Any last words?
No, I guess just thank you so much for having us on. It's been a real pleasure. And we hope anyone who's listening, who's making their own podcast, that found what we were talking about helpful. And for anyone who was just interested to hear from us, we hope you learnt some new stories and interesting things about sort of the creation of our podcast.
Absolutely. Thanks for joining us. And thank you, everyone, for joining us for this live stream of Podbean's Storytelling Podcast Week and Podcasting Smarter live series. For our live event for June, Pride Through History, a live conversation with the creators of the Queer as Fact podcast, featuring Alice and Jace of the Queer as Fact podcast. For those of you who may be joining us for the first time, Storytelling Podcast Week has live stream sessions like this one with top podcasters and storytellers from scripted fiction and nonfiction podcasts from across our world and our imaginations. If you joined late or want to have another listen to this amazing conversation, you can replay this live stream on Podbean's YouTube channel and on our Podcasting Smarter podcast. We're brought to you by Podbean. We're a podcast hosting and monetizing platform and home to over 640,000 podcasts. To start your podcast, head over to podbean.com today. Thank you so much for joining us. Thank you so much, Alice and Jace, and stay tuned for our next live event in July. Oh, thanks, everybody. Bye.